good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. Whichever part of the world and whatever time zone you are in, thank you for joining us for the 2021 edition of the Black Consciousness Festival. This year, we are inviting you to shift. Join with amazing people across the world as we explore the many ways we, as people of African descent, grow, cultivate, produce, share, and rebirth ourselves. Through our ancestral knowledge, historical legacy, pride, power, and practice, let's celebrate the individual and collective ways we navigate through life. Together, we continue to walk in pride, power, and practice. Enjoy the session.
Hello, and welcome to another wonderful conversation. And this conversation is called Black Literature, Amplifying the Experiences of People of African Descent. My name is Erica Ashton. I am the festival director for the Black Consciousness Festival. And it gives me great pleasure to invite Sean Samad, our content and communications director, who will be leading this discussion this evening. At this time, Sean.
Hi, good evening, Erica, and thanks for introducing the conversation. Joining me this evening will be Dr. Natasha Gordon-Chimpembere. Dr. Gordon-Chimpembere has been a professor of African diasporic literature for over 20 years. And she'll tell us a little bit about herself because she has a wide range of very exciting experience. Also joining us will be Jamie Philbert. Jamie is an amazing human being, but apart from that, she's choreographer, performing artist, movement artist, martial artist, cultural researcher, practitioner, educator, and so much more. So welcome,
And
ladies.
Natasha's friend.
And Natasha's friend. Most
Jamie's friend.
So welcome to the conversation, ladies. And of course, tonight we are talking about literature and about amplifying voices and stories that have not necessarily been heard or are not commonly heard, and why that is important. Yeah. I want to start off, and Jamie, you can feel free to jump in and ask questions too, right? I am not running the show. This is a circle of sharing tonight. Yeah.
Can I tell you though, Sean? It's been a while. I mean, I can talk to Natasha whenever I want, right? But she's a busy woman.
Yes.
So I'm actually looking forward to hearing her speak and hearing her answer all these love. So I'll jump in if necessary.
All
yeah?
right. Cool.
Because if you let me talk, I'm just gonna brag about her. So,
Thank you for the permission, then, Jamie. So, Natasha, the first thing I want to ask you, and I guess it's my way of introducing you to the audience who may not necessarily know about you and your work. Many of us in the diaspora don't know about the Afro-Latin population or the population of African descent in Central America. Your bio says that your parents are both from Panama and Costa Rica. So it's one of each, I guess. One from Costa Rica, one from Panama. From your own perspective, tell us about that population, that Afro-Latin population in Central America, and also what it was like growing up in a family like that in New York City. So you're diaspora times two, right? You're African diaspora and then Central American diaspora to New York. Yeah, tell us about that.
Absolutely. Thank you. First, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm really excited to be in such excellent company tonight. And I'm giving a shout out and all the love to Trinidad and Tobago from Costa Rica. So I was born in Brooklyn, and my mom's Costa Rican, my dad's Panamanian. And I would say that we grew up in 70s, right? And I have a sister and a brother who are some of the eldest. And when we grew up more with our Panamanian family who were also immigrants in New York. And so that's sort of the family that I grew up with. But we also did a lot of pilgrimages to Costa Rica to see my grandmother and my extended family. Right now, I have about more than 45 members of my extended family living here in Costa Rica. Only my mother and her three sisters left Costa Rica and moved to the United States, and one cousin. Everybody else remained here. And so I do have to say that they're Central American via Jamaica on both sides. So I
Mm,
actually self-identify not as an Afro-Latina because in actuality that's not my narrative, but I identify as an Afro-Caribbean, very much raised Jamaican raised. Like I really that is my sensibility. Even though my parents speak Spanish, that was their that was I wouldn't say their first language, but it was definitely a language that they acquired very early,
yes.
in Costa Rica and in Panama, but it is a language that is definitely part of their native expression,
Hmm.
right? Um, but my family in Costa Rica, they were situated on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica called Puerto Limon.
Okay.
And that was facing the Atlantic, the
Hmm.
Caribbean. And so even today, the Afro Costa Rican population resides in that area. Even though statistically, like in real numbers, if you were going to do the census, most of those Afro Costa Ricans from Limon actually moved into what we'd call the Central Valley or Costa Rica or San Jose.
Hmm.
Um, but those people who were Afro-Caribbean migrants who came at the turn of the century, so the turn of the 20th century, to work on the banana plantations under the United Fruit Company or build the railroad, or who went to Panama to work on the canal, right? So these are all the same people, all the cousins, everybody just basically went up and down that coast
Yes.
for labor opportunities,
Hmm.
right? So where my people came from. They came from Jamaica looking for new opportunities. My family did not work in the banana plantations. What was interesting is that my great great grandparents, so
Hmm.
Ruth and William Gruzon, from Jamaica came, and they actually ran the northern quarters. And essentially, what that was it was a segregated hotel that
Hmm.
was for the railroad workers, and essentially the white Americans who ran the United Fruit Company. They needed a place to stay when they were either on the coast or they were going to take the train back into the Central Valley to do business. And
Yes.
so my great great grandparents were the sole managers of that space. And what's really amazing is that my great great grandmother Ruth ended up as a widow running that space as a Black woman, right? Running that space for almost 25 years by herself and then with her children. But as a widow, where you wouldn't necessarily see Black women doing that in that space at that
Yes.
time period. So we're talking about 1930s, 1940s.
Hmm.
Um, and so for me, in coming to Costa Rica and thinking about sort of the Afro descended population here, the work that I do kind of combines the Afro Caribbeans who came to do that work that was
Hmm.
paid labor. Obviously, it was not enslavement, even though the conditions, right? Even
Very
Garvey,
close. Yeah.
who came there, obviously questioned the conditions and wanted to amplify unions,
Hmm.
so that there could be labor rights. But my work is really on the enslavement, the colonial period, and creating a bridge or a conversation. Because what I find is that people, and when they talk about Afro Costa Ricans, everybody just associates the Afro Caribbeans
Right.
as migrants who came and
Yes.
essentially then became sort of absorbed,
Yes.
right? In some ways,
Hmm.
right? Not totally absorbed.
Hmm.
Um, but there were people here for 200 years because Costa Rica had slavery for over 200 years. And
Right.
so what happened to those people, right? And the
Yes.
fact that there's a Black Madonna, what happened to those people? And so that's
Yes.
the work that I actually do. I do work on the free and enslaved people of the colonial period, but
Hmm.
then also talk about once Costa Rica ended slavery, then sort of the 60 years that spanned the time when there was no slavery, and then you had this migration of Afro Caribbeans who came to the other part of the country. So that's kind of the work that I do in looking at sort of Afro Costa Ricans. I'm not going to say Afro Latinos specifically, but
Right.
Afro Costa Ricans.
Okay. Wow. I mean, just in that short description, I learned so many new things, and I think we hear stories about Caribbean people who went to Panama to work on the canal, Like I think there's a Barbadian filmmaker, Allison, who did a film recently, a couple of years ago, on that, on Bajans who went to work on the canal. And we know that people from all around the Caribbean, Jamaica, Trinidad, etc., had moved to Panama to work on the canal. But Costa Rica is not a spot that we regularly hear about. So it's interesting to hear that movement also extended to Costa Rica. And of course, it's very interesting to hear the story about your ancestor who, was this black woman who's a widow running a hotel, running a business in this space in a time when that probably was hardly ever seen. Which leads me to my next question. A lot of your work focuses on black women and their roles and the things that they do. Um, is that inspired by the story of your grandmother, or did you learn about your grandmother afterwards, your ancestor afterwards?
That's a good question. So, no, the work that I'm doing in Costa Rica, I mean, I've always known
Hmm.
about my great grandmother Ruth, but obviously, in coming to Costa Rica, that's definitely, I have done a lot of work on her. I've presented not only about her life and sort of the role that she took as a businesswoman, as a property owner, as someone who was very intentional about legacy. But I also was really interested in the time period in which she lived in Puerto Limon. And
Right.
so, which was like the 30s, 40s. So I've been doing a lot of sort of historical research that way. But in terms of being inspired by women, I think that that's always been the case. Like when I was 5 years old, I remember being asked by a cousin, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I'm like, "Why would anybody ask that question of a child? What would they know, right?" So I always tell the joke. Well, three things. I want to be a pig farmer. That's what you get when you ask a 5-year-old.
Yes.
And I'm a vegetarian. I haven't eaten pork for like maybe 30 years or 35 years. So
Yeah.
that's not something. And I'm definitely not a farming girl at all, at all. I mean, I love my plants, but I'm not, I'm not going to be a pig farmer. I said I wanted to marry Bob Hope, right? That's because, you
Did
know,
not know that about you.
Bob Hope was probably on the TV. You know what I'm saying? So
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
like that's what you get when you ask a 5-year-old what you want to be. But
Correct.
the third thing that I said, which was the true, with my spirit speaking, was that I wanted to be a writer.
Wow.
And I said that at 5, and that I was claiming that. And I always go back and I remember that moment. And one of the things that really inspired me as a child growing up in Brooklyn
Hmm.
with my parents are immigrants. They're very, very, very protective. We were in the house. My mom's a teacher, so everything was about school. I was the kid who went to the library, who got the stack of books. I did that every week. I was the reader, so that was sort of how I went into the world. And
Yes.
I did not grow up in the sense of reading books and sort of looking for, like, I wasn't looking for a black character. I wasn't. That's not what I was ever looking for, because I didn't feel like I needed that. There was not a lack of affirming of who I was in my home. You know what I'm saying? It
Mm.
was very fluid. And
Yes.
so what I found in books, and my favorite book, and I know there's lots of controversy around it now, but my favorite book was Little Women
Mm.
by Louisa May Alcott. And the main character, Josephine March, was a writer,
Yes.
and she cut off all her hair. She did all these things, and she wouldn't get married to the boy next door. And she went left when everybody wanted to go right.
Yes.
And that I was like, oh, okay, that's where I saw myself in these books. So I never felt like I wasn't represented in a text, but
Mm.
it definitely inspired me. So definitely, as when I started to go to school and university, in thinking about, my background is in literature, that's what I do. I have
Yes.
always amplified and held up and really investigated and been intentional about reading women's text, and
Hmm.
also sharing and teaching women's text, because it's not just about I'm going to sit in my house and read these books, but it's about, well, how do we actually look at these words? How do we learn about what they're saying? How do we listen? And
Yes.
that's what I have been doing in the classroom for 25 years in different places all over the world.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Natasha. Jamie, I want to ask you.
You gonna ask me something?
Yes,
Before you ask me something, can I say something?
sure,
So
definitely.
one of the I admire and love Natasha Gordon-Chimpembere very much. Let me say that.
Nice.
One of the reasons why I admire and love her is because Natasha is exactly what she just said to you. You know how sometimes people say things, but I am a witness to that in her life. One of the first projects that I did, I invited Natasha to interview her. And I was
Right.
real green with interviewing people. And I remember her, and you probably remember this, Natasha,
I
but she
do.
had just written the Sarah Bartman book.
Right.
Oh, okay.
And it was a project that I had with Nina Simone, Sarah Bartman, like
Oh,
all of
yes.
Carlo, and she loves Frida Kahlo. So if you want to come back and ask some of Frida Kahlo later. So I asked her to be a part of the project and I wanted to interview her. So I remember sending her the questions and she's like, if you want my help with what kind of questions to pose, I'm like, okay, great. But I remember her not downing me, not making me feel like I was dumb, like I didn't know what I was doing. Like it was so encouraging. And I know that I said thank you a bunch of times, and Sasha probably didn't, but I'm saying it again now because it's important, because this time in life is so interesting for me where it comes with my relationships with women and what I came from. I came from strong, beautiful women who encouraged me and lifted me up, right? So I'm always excited when I can talk to one of those women. So I wanted to say that I really am inspired by Natasha and the work that she does. So you can
Thank
ask me.
you.
Well, I just met Natasha tonight, and I'm inspired already. So
Right?
I could just imagine you, Jamie, who's actually,
Teacher, Sean, I'm not really sharing. Right. She's already on the Black Consciousness Festival. All these people, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of people to share her whatever. So,
I
a
hear.
little piece, Sean, a little piece. Just a little thing. Yeah.
I hear you. But Jamie, I was gonna ask you. Natasha talked about her love for books, which is something I can definitely identify with because I was a voracious reader growing up. Did you kind of have the same perspective on books when you were young as well?
My first love was writing before I
Mm.
danced,
I did
before
not know that about you, Jamie.
I started writing when I was 7 years old,
Mm.
and I come from four other siblings and my mommy and my daddy.
Yes.
And right here in Trinidad, in the same house that I live in now, I would find a corner, and if I wasn't running out in the street in my underwear playing cricket, climbing a tree, or doing something, I was by myself in a corner writing. I had stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of poetry and prose. It's where I lived. So when Natasha was talking, I was thinking about the conversation I had yesterday, and I was saying I didn't see myself on television, and I was wondering how come that didn't really affect me in a certain way, but it was because I had books and I had writing, so I would just disappear inside of my stories. And it's the
Right.
same thing now because I'm getting back into writing more now. So I find myself, in a fog and I don't want to talk to people because I'm like all inside of the story.
Yes.
So it's the same thing for me. And I think that I think that it's really important to have that. We had a lot of television in our house, so I watched
Hmm.
a lot of TV as well. But it wasn't anything. I think even when I was watching the TV shows, I was imagining all the scenes that could go there. So
Right.
it
Right.
was something else happening in my mind. So
Yeah.
same thing. Yeah.
And it's interesting, and I think there must be some kind of ancestral linkage to that kind of propensity because I have a 5-year-old niece who's always writing, like she's always looking for a piece of paper and a pen and writing, and nobody's taught her this. It's like it's something that's ingrained into her, so that's really
It's
interesting.
spelling up. It's spelling up. It's OBA. It's I'm
It's
serious.
true. No, I agree.
We get to create these worlds, and the things
Yes.
that I wrote when I was a child, it happened in my life later,
Mm.
right? And there was no way for me to figure that out. So I learned really young that I could write these things, and even though no one believed my little stories, I don't know where this is coming from, but it's coming out of me. So
Yes.
even with the work that Natasha is doing around her family and saying that I'm studying the 30s and the 40s right now to get that information, what may come out of that can also be a futurization of it, and not just the past that she's digging up. So
Definitely, definitely. Natasha, Jamie mentioned one of your first works, and I think one of your, very significant works that kind of led her to you, or was you were writing around the time that she met you.
I'm sorry, Sean. I knew Natasha way before that. I've known
Okay,
her
sorry,
child since she was 2. Let's be clear.
sorry, I'm
Thank-
correcting it because you said that she had released a book or published
Yes.
a book
Yes.
around the time. Yeah,
This
yeah.
is being reported. I would need these things on record that I've known
Not
her
a
since
problem. I'm happy
the
to
first day of
correct
school.
myself, Tony. Definitely. Well, what you're from New York. You're born and raised in New York. Your parents are from Central America, Afro Caribbean. What led you to South Africa, and how did that shape your life and led you to writing this book called Representation and Black Womanhood: The Legacy of Sarah Bartmann?
Okay, that's a whew, you trying to get me to document the journey. What a journey. Okay, so so I graduated from college in
Hmm.
1992. I went to Vassar. And
Okay.
the reason I chose Vassar was because it had one of the best English literature programs on the East Coast, which is where I wanted to be. I didn't want to be so far away from my family, but
Yes.
also it didn't require math. And
Right.
literally, let me just be clear on that. So,
Got you
um,
there.
right. And so Vassar is an elite white space. And
Hmm.
so there were actually, my best friend was from Barbados. I had my little posse of 4: Barbados, Trinidad, and Bahamas. Those are the
Nice.
3 people
Yes.
who were sort of in my posse.
Hmm.
But by the time I got to my junior year, I knew I needed a break. So I did a semester abroad in Kenya,
Okay.
and that changed my life.
Wow.
And it's really interesting. If I could just take us, like, I'll get to the South African journey, but the Kenyan story is really interesting. What
Hmm.
happened was, I was an English major and
Hmm.
everybody else was sort of in Africana studies, but I was like, it was me and one other guy who, we were the English majors, the only Black people in the department. And
Yes.
I was absolutely sure that I was going to go to England for my junior year abroad. And I went into the study abroad office and they were like, but for your major in your literature classes, you needed like a 3.78 and you are the 3.62. So you can't qualify to go to England.
Wow.
And I remember when I left the study abroad office and I walked across the quad to my best friend's dorm room, and I was weeping literally because I was like, I had this vision. I was going to England. I had it in my head. I was going to study
Yes.
them, whatever. And she was in her room and she had a map, just a world map. And I remember her boyfriend was there and he took the map off the wall and he put it on her bed. And he said, just choose someplace else. And
Mm.
literally, I put my hands over my eyes. I spun around 3 times and I touched the map.
Mm.
It was Kenya.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of my life. It was the beginning of my life.
Jamie,
It,
you hear
it,
Obia? That's Obia.
it literally, and you know what I did? I put my coat back on. I walked back over to the study abroad and I said, okay, so can I go to Kenya? They were like, oh, you don't even need an average to go to Kenya. You want to go to Africa? Sure, you could do it. They're like, go for free. And so that's what I did. And
Yeah.
literally, I have I mean, I have then spent the rest of my life from 1991 to now, literally embracing, reaffirming, amplifying my relationship with Africa. And that was the moment. It was the most beautiful experience of my life. But
Wow.
I loved it so much that when I graduated, I ended up getting a Fulbright because I was like, I need to get back to Kenya, but I need somebody to pay for it. So I
Yes.
was like, so I
Of course.
applied and got a Fulbright and went back to Kenya for a year. And that was incredible for me. And so I had already started, thinking about developing relationships, studying African texts. I was deeply involved in studying like different texts from African women from all over. I mean, my
Mm-hmm.
favorite obviously was Nawala Sadawe, who recently passed away from Egypt.
Mm.
But other African women writers, and of course, yes, I read, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe. I mean, like obviously the sort of the male
Classics.
post-colonial writers, but there were women who deeply influenced my just thinking, my own identity, my voice, right? Bessie
Nice.
Head. I mean, I could just go on and on. These are incredible women who really I started to sort of steep myself in because my experience at Vassar I had been trained in like old English and Sir Gawain in the Night. I mean, like really, I was like, I mean, it was very sort of Western canonical white men. And
Yes.
so as I was in Kenya for the Fulbright and then I came back, I made a pact to myself to say, well, I have been trained in sort of, this Western white male literature.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'm now going to, because I have worked, I've done the work, I can reference all of them. I'm only out now going to sort of sit inside of the work of Afro-descendant women. And
Right.
so that was a pact with myself. And
Okay.
so when I came back to the States, so after Kenya, I came back, I started teaching, I went to Columbia for a master's. But what I was hearing, this is right as South Africa gained independence, at the end of apartheid, Nelson Mandela had become president. And I just thought, wow, I was really missing Africa. I was
Mm-hmm.
really missing it. And I just thought, what if I went back? Right. And so what ended up happening was I took a class at Columbia called on South African historiography because I had already had training in oral traditions from
Mm-hmm.
Kenya. And
Mm-hmm.
so in the class, what the like final assignment was that we had to reach out to a South African writer, and we had email at that point. Yeah, I'm trying to think, do we have computers? How do we communicate? By letter, by bird? Like, how do we do it? Yeah, so it was email. And I chose Dr. Isabel Hoffmeyer, who was the chair of the Department of African Literature at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. I knew
Okay.
nothing about her, but her
Mm-hmm.
book, I had read it, and I began a conversation with her. I
Mm-hmm.
interviewed her for my project. It was fine. And I remember like going back to her at the end of the semester and just thanking her. I'd done really well on the project. And she was like, you know what? You should consider doing a doctorate in South Africa. And I was like, ding, a doctorate in South Africa. I was like, yeah. And so you know what I did? Literally, I called the South African embassy the next day, and they have a small library section in the South African Embassy in New York. And
Mm-hmm.
I said, can you give me a list of all the universities that have a PhD program in African literature or in English literature, right?
Right.
That's sort of diasporic. And they
Mm-hmm.
gave me a list, and I literally applied to the list. I got into the University of the Witwatersrand. I bought a one-way ticket to South Africa in 1996, packed up everything, graduated from Columbia, packed up, and I was like, I'm just moving to South Africa. And here's the thing. No one told me that South Africa was cold because I had lived in Kenya, I'd gone to Tanzania. I landed in South Africa in June 1996, and it was snowing. It was
Winter.
snowing.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was winter. I didn't even have a coat. I had nothing. The coldest I've ever been and the hungriest I've ever been in my life was in South Africa. But it was
Wow.
also the best time ever. But
Yeah.
in that process of being in South Africa, I actually learned how to think. I
Mm.
learned theory. I learned how to not sort of be a navel gazing American. No offense to anybody, but essentially that's the exercise in being in the West. I
Mm-hmm.
learned how to shut my mouth and listen because I thought, oh, I came from Colombia. I knew nothing. I knew
Right.
nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really humbled. And I tell you, I was there opening that library with the librarians every single day. And I
Wow.
read and read and read. And that is how I began entering the conversations that were happening around Sarah Bartmann,
Okay.
right? And so that's the long story of how I got to South Africa. But
All
it
right.
was really through that time that I started to think about Sarah Bartmann because there was so much energy that was happening
Mm-hmm.
in trying to get her remains back
Right.
into South Africa during that time period from France.
Nice. That's an amazing story, and I think definitely a story that can inspire so many young people who, struggle with. Jimmy's like, I'm inspired. But yeah, I mean, there's so many young people who, when it comes to making decisions about what to study and where to study, they're always a little bit confused. And when you were talking, I kind of felt, I'm like, wow, Natasha, I was like my spirit sister, because our stories are really parallel. This festival is a byproduct of me doing something very similar to you, deciding to go to study in Brazil after I'd taken one course about Brazil, and my entire life has been changed because of it. Um, so yeah, so I think definitely young people can really learn some lessons from some of the things that you talked about. About being open about different possibilities and just stretching yourself to see what else is possible outside of the traditional path.
I think
So
also having
Mhm.
doing your due diligence, like that was something
Yes,
I took from it. Like she didn't waste any time. I'm
yes,
calling the embassy the next day to find out all the schools. Give me all the schools.
yes, yes.
So it's like it's a and I feel like that is part of what books have done for you. It's made you
Mhm.
limitless in your mind.
Yeah.
So yes,
And,
completely
and,
inspired.
and as you rightfully said before, Jamie, writing as a child is kind of like spelling, as you called it, right? Is
Yeah,
creating worlds. And Natasha took that creating worlds from writing as a child to then creating her own world in reality, through decisions that she made, which is absolutely amazing.
I've seen that world. So the stuff that is happening on my face, like I'm well aware. She's a mighty, mighty creator. So I don't doubt that at all. But it's nice to hear some of these nuances that I haven't heard before tonight.
Mm, thank you, Jamie. But this work, representation on Black womanhood, about Sarah Bartman. Now, let's not assume that everybody knows about Sarah Bartman. I know a
Right.
little bit about her, and on doing research about the book, it's now required reading for all first-year college students in South Africa. That is absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. Tell us what led you to the idea for this book, and what this book means for you.
Ooh, okay. Hmm. So the concept of this book, which actually is an edited collection, right? And it
Okay.
came out in 2011 from Palgrave
Hmm.
as an edited collection. It was an extension of my doctoral dissertation.
Okay.
So what I wrote about, and I went to the University of South Africa for my doctorate,
Hmm.
and what I wrote about was in thinking about Black women and how they're represented and how their bodies are represented,
Hmm.
not how they self-represent, but how they're represented in the world and the language that's used around Black women, whether it's in text, it's visual, um, language in general. What
Right.
I said was, here is the story of Sarah Bartman, and I'll explain a little bit in a second.
Sure.
But my argument was the language that was created around the body of Sarah Bartman, or let's say the language of the Hottentot Venus, because essentially that is the caricature, that's the persona, because very little is known about the woman Sarah Bartman, right? So the caricature of the Hottentot Venus was the same language that has been applied to Black women with sort of in a trajectory that has been unfailing and it has been violent, it has been hypersexualized. And I specifically then countered that with some work that I did with a group of circumcised African women from West Africa who were living in Harlem. And I
Mm.
did sort of a case study with them where they talked about their circumcisions, but in language where they claimed the ideas around their own representation. So it wasn't about lack or victimhood or feeling incomplete or any of that, right? I mean, they had their own language in terms of their sexuality, their sexual expression. That I said, it's in these instances, in these spaces where women are actually speaking for themselves,
Yes.
where you get a more authentic representation. of Black womanhood in general. And so that's sort of been my discussion. Like, here's how the world talks about Black women, and it's incredibly violent. And then why don't we listen to these Black women speak about themselves, right?
Right.
And many of the words and language that was applied to Sarah Bartmann's body were applied to women who are circumcised, right? So
Mm.
it's not about a judgment on the practice. It is about how the women understand it and embody the practice and their culture for themselves, right? So that's sort of the work that I was looking at for the dissertation. But as part of my commitment to honor these women, I could not publish that part,
Right.
right? Because it was highly confidential, it was very vulnerable, it was personal. And so what I did was I then thought about Sarah Bartmann, and the story of this woman who is a Khoisan woman from the Cape region of South Africa, who was essentially an enslaved person under the Dutch,
Wow.
and she was taken. And there's all this discussion about a contract. Well, I've never, ever, ever in all my studies on enslavement of African people have ever seen like a document that says this enslaved person negotiated with their owner and they signed a contract and they had a conversation about it. If your
Right.
property, your property. I mean, we understand that, and maybe there were different forms of agency that she performed, but
Yes.
essentially she was taken
Right.
and to Europe, to London, and she was exhibited in the early part of the 19th century. She was exhibited on a stage, and it was a very dehumanizing process. Eventually, the reason that we know about her is because her story became a court case. In 1815 in London, there was a big uproar because by 1807, the British had decided that slavery ended on their on their land. But of
Empire.
course, they didn't call the colonies to be like, here you go, you're ending slavery. They didn't do that, right? So in the colonies, it was, they were still
Yeah.
benefiting from people not hearing that slavery had been ended
Yes.
in the mother country, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, but what ends up happening is that there's an abolitionist group that basically sees her performance and says this is absolute slavery. We need to do something. And essentially, her owner her South African owner gets a slap on his wrist, and he sells her off to this French animal trainer, who then takes her to Paris and exhibits her in these private salons until she dies. And when she dies, it's very interesting. There's no record of her death, but somehow Napoleon's surgeon, who is George Cuvier, who's probably the preeminent scientist of the day, he's a naturalist, he gets access to her body and he dissects her. And he dissects her genitalia, he dissects her brain, and boils her skin. Does a body cast, the whole thing. And until the 1970s, she was displayed in the Museum of Man in Paris until she was taken down. And then finally, after 8 years of negotiation, both with President Nelson Mandela and then President Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, she was finally brought home and repatriated in 2002. And
Wow.
so, in thinking about her story and thinking about what people were interested in about her, I mean, Sarah Bartmann was a woman who looked like all the other women in her community.
Right.
But she was a curvaceous Black woman. She had round hips, round bum, very petite. She was less than 5 feet tall based on her skeleton, right? And she looked like the other Khoisan women. She was not an anomaly. But for the
Right.
British, who they were essentially in that process, sort of the Darwin idea of naming and labeling and everything, and thinking about the great chain of being. For the Europeans, they use Sarah Bartmann as sort of the plug between the orangutan and the lowest human, right? So she was sort of the link in the great chain of being, and that
Right.
linked the animal to the human. And so she became synonymous not only with Africans, but African women. And the
Right.
ability to display her body, to touch her body, to gawk at her body, to do whatever, it was essentially and gaze at her body, right? Gaze at her rear end, ponder her sexuality in terms of her genitalia. All these things became solidified in that time. It was codified in the language on how to access that type of body, because she became sort of this signature African woman, which then everybody could sort of use as an example. And
Right.
so what I began to hear was that everybody was talking about, the Hottentot Venus, and thinking about even Nicki Minaj, thinking about some of the Kim Kardashian stuff, because the gaze is on the rear, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was also all this sort of contemporary language around music videos, the video vixens, all of these women who were basically still sexualized around their rear ends.
Yes.
And for me, my discussion was like, this is not new. This is a permissiveness and a gaze, and a hypersexual gaze, that has long been established. And
Yes.
so I guess my question in thinking about my work with Sarah Bartmann was, well, who protects the Black woman's body, right,
Mm.
in any space? And so I was really uncomfortable with a lot of discussion that was coming out of the United States around Sarah Bartman, about video vixens, the 21st century sort of, new Hottentots, and sort of Black women reclaiming, their sexuality, and capitalizing on it, right? Commercializing on it. And I thought, what if I asked South African women, South African scholars, to join me in a different kind of conversation, a conversation about the legacy of Sarah Bartman, but with an ethic of care, with an
Mm.
ethic of desire, and thinking not about the persona of the Hottentot Venus, who was actually just a figment of the European imagination. Her, what happens to her as this character of the Hottentot Venus is essentially just telling us about the perversity of the Europeans. It doesn't tell us anything about this African woman and the fact that she managed to survive this experience, right? And so I invited intentionally and put together this book on Sarah Bartman as a way to also prioritize South African women who take her in very differently. She's considered the mother of the nation,
Oh
right?
wow.
She is
Okay.
really the sort of the spiritual mother. And I
Yes.
was just like, let me just step out of the way and have these women kind of be in conversation with each other. And
Right.
and that's how the book came to be. And I have been so
Yes.
blessed with, the most amazing scholars. And this book has really been um, has become a foundational text, I think, in how people understand Sarah Bartman, because it prioritizes South African voices.
That's amazing. Jamie, you didn't tell me about this book.
Listen, the one
Jamie.
thing I want to say about the book
Uh-huh.
is that I remember when Natasha was writing it and when she
Mm-hmm.
was going through that process, I remember it being a spiritual journey, right?
Right.
I remember doing my little choreography around that time and having to think. And her saying it now, it's so interesting where I was then, because sometimes you're not thinking that you were having that mind. But I wanted to, in the dance piece I did, I wanted to take care of Sarah Barton, right?
Mm.
And as she was speaking, I was recollecting her saying that exact thing almost 20 years ago,
Yeah,
Natasha.
yeah, a long time.
Yeah. So for me, and I get really protective because I know Natasha, because I know the work that she's done around Sarah Bartman, because I feel like it's a huge responsibility, right?
Mm.
I feel that way about Black women in general.
Yeah.
So when I hear people, because people are still, when Natasha started speaking, because people don't know a lot about, they don't know anything about Sarah Bartman, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you can't Google it. There's going to be the same information every time, and I feel the same way. In my mind, I was juxtaposing it against the Jamets
Right.
and Old Dame Lorraine, right?
Yes.
And what that looks like in conversation.
Mm-hmm.
What Sarah Bartman, because then I was thinking about the Jamets protecting her, but then I also thought about who protects the Jamets.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know I'm going off, but I'm not
No,
going
not
off.
at all. You're not going off at
Inspired
all. It's all
by
connected.
what
Yeah.
well, I'm thinking about my 20-something-year-old self, and what it did to me then and what it's doing to me here. And Natasha speak about it now. Um, yeah, Sarah Bartmann is close to my spirit because of that project, but because of, I remember when I first read her story, what was out there in the world, not from Natasha's work. And then reading the bits of Natasha's work I was able to read at that time. And going, well, shit, there's, I didn't read anything before this, you know, I didn't know who this woman was. And it made me think about my own story, right? And it's not just something that Black women go through. Yes, Black women go through it on a high level. But it's what they've done in Black literature to Black people.
Yes.
Yeah. Toni Morrison talks about it. You know, they built this whole Black persona. You know, we're violent, where everything was built off of the enslavement of us, right?
Yes.
So everything was about our depression, our suppression, nothing about our joy. Like, we don't get happy. We don't have love. And if we do have love, it has to be broken apart in their stories.
Yes.
So thinking about Sarah Bartmann, representation and visibility, the life and representation is actually what's the title?
Representation of Black womanhood.
The
legacy of Sarah Bartmann, yeah.
Thinking about the book, again, my mind is going right now, and I can't stop it. I'm trying to stop it, I can't. It's going to our culture. It's because of where I am in my research right now too. It's having me think about that. It's having me think about my work around Kalinda, around Bois women, around Carnival, because Kalinda's connected to Carnival. I won't go on a Kalinda kick right now. But how all those things intertwine. When Natasha mentioned 1807 and them ending slavery in Britain, but didn't holler at everybody else and say, hey, you know, it's over. And I just read that recently. And what that means, right? Because her body being shipped to London, what was going on in France, what was happening in Haiti at that time. So all of those things are connected. So I'm thinking about the connections. I'm thinking about the lack of visibility that they had, that we still had, right? How these women still look at Sarah Bartmann as the mother of a space. So why it's so important for us to research and write. So I'm gonna end by just saying that I feel like Natasha Gordon-Chimpembere is really dope and inspired me. That's just like the punctuation on everything.
Well, Natasha, I'm gonna ask you permission to extend the conversation a little longer.
Yes.
We got permission from our tech.
You hour?
We're almost there. It's 47 minutes in.
Yeah.
But we're gonna extend it a little longer because, as you just said, Natasha is dope. So we
Yeah,
need to
she's
talk
dope.
with her a little more, you know. And we've only kind of like scratched the surface, you know. Natasha, so we talked about your book. That was your first book.
Yes.
Representation on Black womanhood, right? And so let's talk about some other elements of your work, right? Black literature is incredibly important, as you know, as all of us here would agree. What impact can it have in the development of future generations of people of African descent?
Well, you know, there's this idea that Black people don't read. And let me tell you, other people can believe that, but I'm telling you, absolutely, Black people read.
Yes.
And I am in so many reading groups and Facebook groups and just clubs. And my goodness, people are consuming literature in ways that are just gorgeous. And people are writing, you know, obviously Black literature, what does it do? It affirms, it says this is a world, right? This is a world. And and Jamie mentioned Toni Morrison. And the people's biggest critique of Toni Morrison was that she did not include whiteness in her world. Whiteness was, you know, it was not a central character. It did the relationships did not revolve around whiteness. The world that she created were worlds that Black people lived in. And we have our own worlds. We
Yes.
absolutely do. Whether you're talking about Afrofuturism, African futurism, because there are differences. We're talking about historical fiction. We're talking about memoir. We have our own worlds that we don't have to actually translate our lives, our loves, our hopes, our fears. We don't have to translate that for anyone else because in actuality, we do buy each other's books. People are supporting, I mean, I would say across the board, I see Black women specifically investing in purchasing books. I see it, I mean, there are so many examples of of communities of Black women who are choosing to read Black women or read Black literature, men or women, um, and and then discuss it, right? So it's not just I read it, but it's to bring it in conversation, to make it alive. And
Yes.
so for me, it's really about Black literature is obviously it needs to be more disseminated, right? Because obviously we still talk about the ways that the publishing industry, particularly coming out of New York, is still I mean, the percentages are quite small in terms of representation. But I
Right.
think there are writers who are being very creative, right? So they're self-publishing,
Self-publishing.
they're going outside of the United States. Because it's not about the $1 million advance, which I have to say some Black writers are getting that $1 million advance, right? But it's more about I need to get my work out there, and whoever comes to it can come to it, right? And I
Yes.
don't want to make it so high end or so expensive that it's inaccessible. And I
Right.
certainly don't want to create a text where I'm constantly explaining or catering to an audience that doesn't look like me,
Yes.
right? And so for me, Black literature has been critical, but that's the umbrella, right? So we're going to talk about Black literature. I love historical fiction. That is kind of
Me too.
that's what I write. That's
Yes.
what I love to read. But I also love African women, and the work that I became educated in, like these African women writers who were sort of in the post-colonial world of maybe like after the Heinemann series, the African Heinemann series of like the 1980s, like those books that came out of that time period.
Yes.
The Tetsi Dangarambas, the Nawala Sadawes, the Bessie Head, the Buchia Macheta, Ama Atadu. I mean, these are like, I mean, not the, I mean, these are the women that I essentially I learned to think through these women, but I also at the same time then read the Morrison and the Jamaica Kincaid and the Paulie
Yes.
Marshall. And so like I was really grounded in these spaces because we are fluid. We're fluid. I mean, we move through spaces, but there's so many linkages in our experiences, right? So there's a universal sense of I can understand that even if this woman is talking about Zimbabwe or Egypt, or I can understand that because this woman is talking about Tobago, or I can understand that because this woman's talking about a brownstone in Brooklyn, right? And so for me, that's been the impact of African or Black literature. It's about visibility. It is
Yes.
about listening and insisting and being present and not translating our lives
Yes.
to, if you don't get it, you don't get it. It's all
Right.
right.
Correct. Correct. And that's really important. That ability to write our stories and to get visibility in our own communities, and to ensure that our own communities have access to those works, which segues really well into my next question, which is about your writers retreat called Tingo Said. Is it still operational? Well, I guess with COVID you kind of had to put it on hold a bit. Um, but
Yeah.
you said that your work prioritizes the voices of emerging scholars. Why are these kinds of interventions or programs essential, do you think, in our communities?
Okay, that's a fantastic question. So yes, Tango said
Hmm.
the writers' retreat happens, and yes, January is happening. I'm really excited about it. It will be
Is
the
it for
sixth.
anybody, or are there like prerequisites to get into this writers?
No, it's for Black and Indigenous and people of color
Right.
of any of any genre. So it's not specific, but I have a wait list that goes until 2024 right now.
Wow. So I need to put my name on now. It's like 2026. Okay.
Well, we'll meet up in Carnival first in 2025, and
Excellent.
then come back in 2026.
Nice.
So I have to say, tengo sed, which in Spanish means I'm thirsty,
I'm
right?
thirsty. Yes.
But I was not, I was thinking about it with this idea of I'm thirsty for community. I'm thirsty for like a writing space. I'm thirsty for knowledge, right? I'm thirsty for learning. I'm thirsty for the potential and the expansion that I can possibly do in a creative space.
Yes.
And I have to say this. So my writing up until about 8 years ago, when 7.5 years ago when I moved to Costa Rica, has purely been nonfiction academic.
Okay.
Right. So I've never, I mean, when I was a kid, yes, I did some creative writing and I did some poetry, trying to be a little poet when I was in South Africa, and that wasn't whatever. I think the only person who liked my poetry is my husband.
Most important. Most
Right,
important.
right.
Because
But
I'm sure it was good. Natasha's hilarious. Go ahead, Natasha. Go ahead.
so, I got over my little poetry thing because, I was trying to do that little book, Brooklyn girl, in Kiru books, whatever. And so I knew that I wanted to write a book. And
Yes.
so when I moved to Costa Rica, I thought, gosh, this is such a beautiful place. And I would love my friends to come and be part of this space and to just write, because I had just started writing my novel, which is Finding La Negrita, which will be published next year. I just started writing it 7.5 years ago here when I landed in Costa Rica.
Right.
And I just thought, what if I put together a retreat, right? And I'm not a business person. I'm an academic, right? So I'm just like, how do I do this? But I did it because I know how to organize. I've organized conferences. I've organized birthday parties. I've done that.
I'm scratching my
Transferable
nose.
skills.
You see me scratching my nose because she does this thing where she talks about I'm not this, I'm an academic.
She's modest.
She's been
Yeah.
doing this for as long as I've known her. So she go, I'm not an artist. And I go, what does that mean?
What is she talking about?
I don't know what she's talking about. So I just want to, we talk about protecting Black women. In this moment, I want to protect Natasha. I let her know that she is all of it. Okay? So,
Yes.
because
Yes.
people said is running, so I'm going to say that you're a businesswoman.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
But you have to learn the hard way. So I got the first group together, and it included people that I love who are incredible friends and writers. I mean, particularly one writer from Trinidad, Anton Nimblett, who's published several collections of short stories. I just love his work. And essentially, I got this first group together, got a space, a private farm, and arranged transport, got somebody to cook some food, bought all the food, did all that stuff myself. And we spent a week in this space, unplugged. We had no internet for a week. It was like amazing, right? And that was in 2015. And every year from there, I have been hosting a retreat in January, but in last year we could not. I mean, everybody had paid up and everything, but we could not go because of COVID.
Right.
So we had to move everybody to 2022. And so all the wait list of people, and I only do like 10 to 12 people. Everybody's been pushed back.
Wow.
Everybody's been pushed back. And I have to say that I'm intentional about the space. Where we are right now is, I've learned, like, after the first 2 or 3 times, I was like, okay, so I need someone to take care of some of this stuff. And I used to do this stuff,
Logistics,
right?
yeah.
Exactly. So I found this beautiful, beautiful wellness retreat up in the mountains that has everything, farm to table, organic, vegan space, yoga. I became a yoga teacher, and so I'll teach yoga, and I run the writing workshops, and it has just become this incredible space. And not only that, what happened was the community of people who started to attend the retreats became connected all year round. And so we have with Dr. Catherine Sophia Bell, who's at Penn State. She's a Black philosopher, and she's been attending for several years. She set up La Belle Vie Writing Group. And basically, for 2 years now, we are online in 6 week chunks all year through writing. It's a writing accountability group. And that is how I was able to sort of bring my manuscript to a close and actually edit it and do all those things, because I had that space. But it comes out of the retreats and meeting these amazing people,
Yes.
and being in community with them, and now being family, essentially.
But can I tell you, Natasha, do you see that you build, I mean, and we can talk about it as a collective. The collective built the community, but you built that community. You did that. Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that you are recognizing and acknowledging that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was intentional. At first, to be honest, it was selfish at first, just going, I'd love to write with some other people. And I remember reading the first like 10 pages of what is a portion of my novel now, right? Reading that to the group. And I was really nervous because I'd never written fiction before. Like, it was my first attempt at historical fiction. I had done years of research, but it was my first time really going, I'm not going to do this academic voice. I'm going to try to write this novel. And I shared it in that space for the first time. And that was the reason that the idea came to me. And now it's a space where I teach writing. So I love to do the coaching. I love to provide the support, but I also read my own work in community because you always need feedback.
Yes. Yeah. This some of the things that you said about how you created this idea of the writers retreat, your intentionality, that you were creating a space and a community, and the thing about writing accountability, which is the first time that I've heard that, but it's so empowering, is really connected to yesterday we had a conversation about transformative community, and a space in Canada where they are transforming the community through health services. And I'm seeing the connections because they talked about the same things about, being intentional about how we create spaces as people of African descent, and using the principles and the values that have always resided in our communities. And of course, accountability being a really important part of that. So I see that, the connection between what they're doing and what you're doing. And it's in different areas, but using the same kinds of processes, which is quite interesting. One of you do write for Essence. I've seen some of your articles for Essence. In one of your articles, you wrote that in every part of our journey, we're guided by our antepasados, our ancestors, which is an idea that seems to also be kind of cropping up in a lot of our conversations, connected to this theme this year, shift. And you put this into action. You've talked about, that episode of you deciding on studying in Kenya, picking up and going to do your PhD in South Africa, and then of course recently when you uprooted your life in the US and moved to Costa Rica. What advice would you give to those who have had enough of the spaces that they're in? And Jamie, you can answer this too because you've done the same thing. And are in want of something different, but might be a little reticent or a little scared about how to take that step.
How to run away from America? Is that what you're asking?
Not America only, because there are other spaces where people are, right? That they
Pack it up and go out of that place.
Yeah, but how do you summon?
Right? But yeah. Go ahead, Natasha. You answer first because before Natasha answers, I want to say that before Natasha Chimpembere and her husband, Masuko Chimpembere, up and left Brooklyn to go to Costa Rica, I was planning to go back home. And her husband told me, no, Jimmy, you shouldn't go yet. You know, not yet. And then like a year later, he's like, he didn't even want to tell me, right? So he's like, no, we're moving to Costa Rica. I'm like, what? You told me not to go nowhere. So go ahead, Natasha, tell everybody how to get out because they did it. I think you guys moved a year before. Was it a year before I moved? Yeah. So a year before.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what I find interesting too, I mean, besides the courage and all the things that would have led you to that, is you're describing it as connected to your antepasados, and so that's what I would like to hear about.
Yeah. I
Well,
mean, when I was telling my family in Costa Rica that and even my parents, that I'm going back, they were
Hmm.
like, "You're leaving New York, a tenure track position, like your kids are in private school, like your husband has a great job at the Brooklyn Museum, like what's happening?"
Hmm.
And you know, I guess there were two things. One, I had already begun to do some research on the Black Madonna in Costa
Nice.
Rica.
Hmm.
And I had a really interesting experience that really launched this book for me. Um, I had gotten a small grant to just spend a week in Costa Rica
Hmm.
on my own. And
Okay.
in my entire life, I've never been to Costa Rica alone. I always went for Christmas with my family, with sister, and going to see grandma, and had never, and it wasn't vacation. It was
Hmm.
sort of I had to go to the archives, I had to go to the library, and so my cousin was like, "Oh, you can stay with me for the week." And basically, she was like, "Okay, well, life's going on. Everybody has to work. Here's the keys, and there's the bus stop."
Hmm.
I was like, "What? Like, what you mean?"
Sounds familiar.
And I was just like, "Oh, you mean I have to? No one's gonna drive me around. No one's gonna." And he was like, "Are you crazy?" And so it's not vacation. So I did. I went to the bus stop, got my little coins together, with my struggle Spanish, and I was just like, let me do this. And I got to the archives. I got to the National Library. I started to find all these documents. People were really helpful. And then I remember going to like a coffee shop before I got on the bus back. And I just thought, oh, I could do this. Like, this is me engaging with Costa Rica with my family not attached to it, but
Hmm.
there was a potential of a life there. And then
Hmm.
I remember coming back to New York. And then I had already made the decision that I wanted to do some work on the Black Madonna
Right.
and really thinking about Costa Rica's very interesting sort of national narrative that is, Costa Rica is sort of the Switzerland of Central America. It's this racially, it's homogeneous. It's sort of these, mestizo or white looking Costa Ricans who have sort of these European values, very Catholic country. And I just thought, how do you reconcile that with these Afro descendants that live in different pockets of your country and the fact that 93% of your population venerates a Black Madonna? Like, how does that work, right? And so, and like having conversations with my mom, who was like, in school, we didn't grow up knowing that slavery existed in Costa Rica. So I was really intrigued, and
Hmm.
that's what the research took me to. And then I went to go see the Black Madonna in the Basilica, and I basically made a commitment. I was like, if you open all the doors, I will come and write the story for you.
Mm.
And that's exactly what happened. I went back home to Brooklyn, and it was really interesting. My husband and I had just applied for a mortgage to buy the little house we were in Brooklyn. And when I came back, we had gotten approved. And
Hmm.
so we literally sat, and I will never forget this. We sat on the bed, and my husband said to me, "Do you really want a 30-year commitment to this house?"
Mm.
And to Brooklyn and raising our children here. And this is right at the tail end of Obama. And
Right.
so obviously we read history and we're like, well, we know what's coming.
Mm.
And we have a black son, right?
yeah.
And a black daughter. And so we know what's coming. And so he was like, why don't we go to Costa Rica? It was
Mm.
his idea. So he had been to Costa Rica many times with me over the years, and we take our children for Christmas. But living in Costa Rica, and he doesn't speak Spanish, and
Right.
living in Costa Rica is radically different than
Yes.
saying, I'm going to go to visit your family for Christmas and we're going to be at the beach, right?
Right.
Hmm.
And it took us about a year, and we did. We bought one-way tickets. We packed 8 suitcases. We packed a lot of books, and we moved, and that was it. And we found what we first did was we found a school for our kids.
Mm.
And once we found a school for our kids and we knew that they would be comfortable in that space, it was an international school, we then realized that we just live someplace around the school and
Right.
figure out the life after that. But once the kids were settled, then
Yes.
it would be okay. And
Right.
so, a lot of people say to me or said to us, you're leaving us, because we were very much part of a community in Brooklyn. You're leaving us, you're selling out, you're abandoning the struggle or whatever. And I was like, where in the world do you know where there is not Black oppression someplace? So I'm just going to go pick up the struggle over there. I actually have about 3 generations of antepasados, ancestors buried right here.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of my place. I don't have, beyond that, it's a slave story, right?
Mm.
So I don't have anything beyond that. My husband, who is Malawian American, can go all the way back, generations upon generations upon generations, and they have a land in
Mm-hmm.
Malawi, but I don't have that story. So the furthest place I can go is right here, and so I was just like, I'm just going to go and see what the Black community is doing in Costa Rica. And I've very much been part of that, very much inside of this community. Um, but not everybody, it's not for everybody,
Mm.
right? So the only advice I think I can give is that if you are really feeling in your spirit that you want to leave, do your due diligence. Just don't pick up and go, particularly if you have a family. It has to be something that everybody can invest in.
Mm-hmm.
If people are unhappy, then it's not going to be successful. And
Right.
if you have children, for me, at least the way I understand it, the children they're the temperature, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones that you have to check in. And if they're doing good and they're thriving, then you can actually do the thing.
Right.
And
Yeah.
no matter what, even if it's a familiar place, visiting someplace that's familiar, like your parents' home is familiar, but
Mm-hmm.
living there is a totally different thing. When you have to pay the
Yes.
bills, you got to navigate the neighbors, you got to find
Mm-hmm.
a place to live, you got to figure out the relationship with even your family
Mm-hmm.
and the space that you want to create with your own family and the boundaries that you want to create in setting up this new life,
Yeah.
And so my thing is, always come and visit a place first,
Mm-hmm.
right? Even if it's just for a couple of weeks, go and check out the area, see if it's viable for you, talk to people. Don't stay at the resort, right? Go and literally get on the bus in the way that I did. Go sit in a coffee shop, go check out the mountains, do a little hiking,
Yes.
avoid the tourist areas, and really see if you're ready to go,
Mm-hmm.
do the work first.
Yes.
The other thing is that nothing's forever. And
True.
this is what, and I say that to my kids all the time. I'm like, you're being dramatic, but it's not forever. It doesn't, if you don't like something, you can always leave.
Yes.
You can always leave and go and recreate something else.
Mm-hmm.
But so you don't have to create your own prison. And
Yes.
for me, that's really liberating. The idea of, okay, if it didn't work, I'm not going to beat myself up. Let's try something else. It's
Right.
okay.
Yeah. 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 Lovely. Jamie?
The ancestor part of it, from the time that I left Trinidad when I was 9, I
Mm-hmm.
nagged my parents about going back home.
Really?
Yeah, like I was irritating. I was
Okay.
very irritating. Um, because I was dreaming about home.
Right.
Um, I dreamt about home until I came back home. I was having the same dream over and over again about my neighborhood, about this river is no longer there, but it used to be this the bush is there now, but it used to be
Mm-hmm.
this river and it used to be horses. There's still like horses in the back, so I always see the horses. I would always dream about. We don't have crocodiles, but we have. What do you call?
What did-
Alligators.
No,
Cayman. Cayman.
kind
Oh,
of
Cayman,
like
Cayman.
crocodiles, but in America, in my mind, it was crocodiles, right?
Yes.
So the caiman and stuff. So for me, it was always that. A couple of years before my father passed away, I told him that I was very seriously considering going back home, that I was pretty much done. Like I felt like I'd done all I needed to do. We have a house in Trinidad. It's not making sense. Like I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I need a change. I was also tired of being cold.
Right.
Um, I don't I don't like to be cold. That sounds really small, but I just don't. I'm also very, I don't want to be cliche and say free spirited, but I'm very spirit filled and
Mm-hmm.
I'm very free spirited.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So when I feel something, it is not something that I can really ignore.
Right.
So I've had that conversation with my dad, and probably 4 years later, he would have passed away.
Okay.
When he passed away, I was done. I was like, okay, yeah, I'm out. This is it. So I would have left probably the month after my father passed away. My father's wish before he passed away, 6 months before he passed away, he was very adamant about telling me that he wanted to be buried in Trinidad. So we had this whole thing because my mother is buried in the States.
Right.
So I told him, I said, you have nerve. You want to be buried in Trinidad, but you're going to leave my mother in the ground in the States. Like, you have nerve to want to be buried. I was like, okay, let me tell you now, that is going to be expensive.
Right.
And we don't have no money for that. So he's like, I don't care, you could burn me. And he was very serious. He's like, cremate me, but I want to go home, you know? And I'm a daddy's girl, and I respect my daddy's wishes. So at every cost, he was going to get back home. He is in Laventille, cremated. And once he came home the year after that, I came back home. I had one bag, because I have no children, had no man, that not one that I was bringing to Trinidad with me anyway, right? I had one bag packed with a bunch of fabric, and my suitcase, my sewing machine, and the other bag was packed with the books that I like to read, and I think I maybe had one other bag, and that's what I came to Trinidad with. I did not bring my stuff with me initially. It was definitely, like I said, the ancestral pull was there before my father passed away, and it definitely became that when he passed away. My mother is in my heart. I like people that knew my mother would understand that I am very much Veronica. But I couldn't, losing two parents in the States and then having one that was going back home, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna go there. I understand that this journey, it's a bit of a privilege, right, to speak from the space of being able to get up and just move and do that. We have a house here, so I didn't have to worry about rent and all those different things.
Yeah.
The house that I live in is an ancestor space because I sleep in the room that my parents slept inside of.
Right.
Returning home, I didn't know it at the time when I returned home. I definitely felt like it was a call home, that something was calling me home, that the ancestors were definitely calling home. I was clear about that, but I didn't know what for. I thought it was just to do what Jamie does, right? To sew and to dance and to write and to teach children. And now I know that I was called home to be a bois woman, to do this work of Kalinda. Still some days I'm like, I'm not sure what Kalinda want me to do, but whatever she says, I'm gonna do it, you know? And I think it's about that listening, spending time being quiet. I spend a lot of time, I talk a lot. So I spend a lot of time being quiet. That journey into Kalinda, and I always talk about this, I don't want to really get into the accident, but I had a car accident. And it was that transition was so weird. And I was just saying today that it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. I've never had a major injury when I was in New York, right? I was safe, but I wasn't safe. Yeah, my spirit wasn't really as safe as it could be. So while I don't feel like I have everything materially in this space right now, the ancestors are doing things that are beyond what I've asked for, beyond what I could have imagined for this time in my life. And I'm clear that connection of coming home was necessary. What I would tell someone else, I think you have to listen. I think it really depends on your ritual practice. I think it really depends on where you are daily. I don't think I could give someone advice. So I could tell you all the logistical things that you could do to get up and move from that space. But I think you have to listen to your own spirit. You have to look around you and see what's going on in your own space, and figure out, do I belong here? And I think that you won't really have to ask yourself the question, because you feel those things. You know when you don't belong somewhere. Um, and while the planning of it is fantastic, sometimes you just need to pick up and go. I respect and honor what Natasha's saying when you have a husband and you have children, but sometimes like that decision has to be made. When we left at 9, I didn't agree with my parents' decision to move from Trinidad to America.
Right.
Nobody checked in with me
At
about that.
9?
That was gonna be cool.
Yeah,
You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah.
But even that was divine. I feel like there was a call. There was something that was calling my parents to that space. The
Yeah.
things that I've grown and experienced and know in a certain way. And where I am now in the space of becoming, I would not have been able to experience that if they didn't follow that ancestral call. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think sometimes, yes, the planning, yes, the right thing to do is respect your children, have those conversations. And then sometimes the children need to understand that this is what we're doing,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Because the ancestors said so, not because mommy and daddy said so, because
Yeah.
the ancestors said so.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my advice. People need to sit quiet, listen to the trees, look out for all the signs. Sometimes you're watching a ratchet show, the sign might come that way. Because I look for my signs in everything. You know, I don't.
It's true. Yeah, you're right.
I live in
Absolutely
the
right.
multiverse. Like I'm always,
Yeah.
inside of that multiverse, and I'm clear
Yeah.
that my ancestors are real. They're dread. They dread.
Mm-hmm.
They don't care. They'll come through any
Any
channel.
form, exactly. Yeah.
They have no time for it. So
Yeah.
listen is the best, the easiest, and
Listen.
simplest. Listen and then move, and don't
Mhm.
stick when they say to move.
Don't
Because
stick. Listen and don't stick.
you'll
Very
have a
good.
car accident like me because I wasn't listening,
You're
which
not
is why.
listening, so they need to give you something loud for you to listen.
Right.
Yeah, that's it. She don't listen. She didn't hear us. So let me do this
Exactly.
car accident thing. And but like I said, that experience brought me into a fullness
Mm.
of becoming Jamie. And not that I wasn't Jamie before, right? But all of who I was before is now connected to all of who I'm becoming. And it wouldn't have happened if I did not listen and if I do not listen now. So if I want to pack your bags, you can start packing, but listen to where they want you to go.
To where they want you to go.
Yeah.
I know it was a long way around just to tell you to listen, but you had to hear the whole thing.
We appreciate it, Jamie. We appreciate it. Natasha, to wrap up this conversation, you are doing this really incredible work with the Writers Retreat. You're writing your own book, which is coming out. When is your book coming out? Finding La Negrita?
Finding La Negrita will be out by Jaded Ibis Press on September 13th, 2022. But I
Nice.
think pre-order should be available in the late spring on all of, Amazon and all the other things.
Okay, great. So the name of the book, audience, is Finding La Negrita, and it's going to be available for pre-order in spring of next year. Get your copy. I'm sure it's going to be absolutely fantastic. And so connected to everything that's happened in your life and all the things that you have done and are doing right now, what advice would you give for those who have stories to tell, want to write, like myself? Because I desperately want to write, but it just isn't happening. It's probably not the time. But find it challenging. What advice would you give them?
Just put it on the page.
Just put it
Put
on the
put
page.
on the page. And that's what I tell my students. I teach writing. And
Mhm.
so it's, I have an idea and just get to the page. You
Mm.
can't do anything on a blank screen if you're fighting it. There's no such thing as the perfect sentence. Just get it on the page. Start writing,
Yeah.
or carry a notebook with you.
Mm.
I mean, I'm not a good example of somebody who has discipline in terms of writing. So, I mean, there are some people, and Jamie's like, whatever.
Jimmy's looking
Listen,
around like, what is she
listen.
talking about?
No, well, I'm trying to.
2 books later and a whole bunch of other stuff in between. But okay, she is no
No,
mistake.
but that's not how I write. There are all these people who are like, every morning I get up and have my coffee, I
Right,
look
right,
out the
right, right,
window
right.
and I sit for 2 hours every morning. Who has that? I mean, like I am juggling, 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 juggling. I mean, there's no way,
Right.
I mean, there's no way that that can happen in my life.
Mm.
And the way that it showed up is the writing comes when the writing comes. For me, it was these characters showed up. Literally, they showed up, their name showed up on the page, and I was like, okay, y'all gonna do this. And I just put together the whole, it came.
Yes.
And I mean, I'm really lucky that I have an editor, Lisa Pegram. I love her. That she is someone who found me, who jumped into this book, supported my work, but from beginning to end. I mean, we didn't. There was nothing. It was kind of like I want it as is. Can you imagine? I mean, the only other person I've heard that is Arundhati Roy, who I love. She's an Indian writer. Her book, God of Small Things. I'll never forget this, and I was always amazed by it.
Mm.
It was published with only changing one sentence. There were no edits, nothing. One
Wow.
sentence in the entire manuscript was changed. And I was like, that, wow. And it was almost the same experience with me. I mean, it was kind of like, okay, you got to change a little verb tense here and there, but essentially the stories, I'm going to take it as it is, and we're going to put it out to the world. And it was just, it was an incredible, experience for me. So for people who want to write, everybody has a story and
Yes.
everybody's voice is important. And you might write a story and the only person who sees it is you, and that's totally fine. We don't have to write thinking, okay, this is going to be the cash cow and buy my house with this book, and that, because that defeats the purpose of honoring the voice and the experience. But
Yes.
I can't say every morning, you have to write, get up at 6 o'clock and write, or at nighttime. I didn't do it that way. I wrote whenever I could, at nighttime. I mean, very different than academic writing, which is, you have to do like research. There's certain formats and templates you have to use. There's
Yes.
language that you have to use. Creative writing is totally different. And
Mm.
so for me, it was just a process of, you know, getting it out, sitting there. Sometimes it would be a Sunday and I would just, start writing. And then sometimes it would be like 3 months and I haven't touched the page, you
Right.
know? And then when I did, I'd write, 30 pages. So that's why I said I don't have any particular like formulas.
Right.
I guess the only formula that I teach my students that I feel is incredible is the Pomodoro Method. So it's this concept of 25 minutes, right? 25 minutes of writing, and you set a timer, and it's 25 minutes, and then you have 5 minutes off, and then you can go back to do another 25 minutes. But 25 minutes where you're not editing, you're not doing research, you're not, scrolling down the rabbit hole of social media. You're literally on the page, even if you're just writing two sentences in 25 minutes. The point is that you are creating new text. And that has been very successful in teaching writing, in coaching writing, in just supporting other people who have stories to tell. The Pomodoro Method worked for me because sometimes it's like, well, I don't want to sit in front of my computer for 3 hours because I don't have 3 hours, but maybe I can do two Pomodoros today, and that
Yes.
will be enough.
Okay. Okay. That's very, very useful. Very, very useful. Natasha, I want to thank you for saying yes to the Black Consciousness Festival, first of all, um, and being Jamie's friend, for devoting your time and energy today to talking to us about Black literature and why it's so important to amplify Black voices, and for us all to be a part of that process, whether we're writers, readers, people who promote books, just all getting involved in telling our stories in one way or another. I want to really say thank you on behalf of the festival.
Thank you
Um,
so much. It's an absolute honor to be here. This is a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. Yes,
I,
Julie.
I just wanted to say that, Natasha's saying that there is a waiting list. Potential said, no, you got to know how to do things, right? If we just happen to be in Costa Rica
True. We
when
can
Tango
happen to
Fest
be in
is
Costa.
going on and
Hmm.
Natasha needs some help,
Hmm.
with
Yeah.
the retreat,
Yeah.
we could
Like,
absolutely help Natasha, is all I'm saying, Or if
Natasha, I
you
cook
need a
really
little
well. I'm good at
If someone
planning.
can get me some Band tickets, then
done. See,
Done.
we do
Done.
this. Cass, if you listening, we need you to help us out with Tango Fest. For your people, Cass. I'm just saying.
Yes.
So Natasha, the joke is that Natasha is a huge Cass fan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she told me. She told me.
She's huge. The public doesn't, I don't know if the public knows. So just in case someone is listening and has a close connection with Cass, Natasha, the new book out, Finding La Negrita, right? So
Yes.
you do a whole book launch with Cass, right?
Right.
I'm manifesting, spelling right now, spelling
wow.
things into space. But what you were saying, Natasha, about I know we're closing up, Sean. What you were saying about just right, I think that people miss what that means. Like, that it just means getting words on the page and like being okay with whatever is there on the paper, you know? So I totally felt you when you said that, because I'm in that mode right now. So when I write, I'm just like, whatever is there is what you wrote today, and you wrote. And it's fine. Yeah.
Excellent advice. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here, Natasha. I'm glad that I got to sit on a conversation with you. I don't think y'all needed me here at all, but I was happy to be.
No, thank you for being here.
Yes. And I'm grateful to see your face all the way across the pond, Costa Rica.
We'll see you in Costa Rica soon, Natasha.
Here we go. Now you're talking, Sean.
Good night, everybody. Good night to our audience.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's beautiful.
Thank you, Natasha Gordon-Chimpembere, Dr. Natasha Gordon-Chimpembere.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
Take
Blessings,
care.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Blessings and peace.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation at the Black Consciousness Festival. All of our sessions are available on our website, theblackconsciousnessfestival.com, and on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. All of our conversations are intense, fun, enriching, and may also be challenging as we explore different facets of our history as people of African descent. Remember, you can find more on the festival on our website, theblackconsciousnessfestival.com. Have a good night, good evening, good afternoon, and a good morning, wherever you are joining us from. And remember to walk in pride, power, and practice. Thank you.